Good evening and welcome to the 2024 version of the Local History Guild. Those of you who have watched previous Local History Guilds will notice that I am not Michael Dyer. Michael initiated and hosted these events for approximately 3 years. Michael is now the curator of maritime history at the Mystic Seaport Museum. However, knowing that this is a popular event viewed from the comfort of one's own home, we would like to keep it going. So for 2024, the Local History Guild will be held quarterly and hosted by different members of our curatorial staff. Later this year, our discussions will be hosted by our chief curator, Dr. Naomi Slip, along with Imelda Laxton and Marina Wells. As with previous Local History Guild conversations, we invite you to type questions for our panelists towards the end of the event. And as moderator, I will direct these questions to them. So for those of you that I have not met before, my name is Robert Rocha, Associate Curator of Science and Research for the museum. Most people call me Bob, and you can do that as well tonight. I'm sure that's what Dre and Kimberly will do. But I'm going to beg your indulgence for a couple of minutes as I set the stage for tonight's presentation. So tonight we'll focus on the evolving relationship between seals and people. You might ask, why is the New Bedford Whaling Museum hosting a discussion about seals? The connection is based in the William A. Watkins collection of marine mammal sound recordings, which is part of a gift we received from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in 2014. It is also based on a source of funding for much of that research over that 50-plus year span, and that is the U.S. Navy. So seals, indeed, all pinnipeds are marine mammals, and seals make sounds that were recorded along with the sounds of whales, dolphins, and porpoises by Dr. William Cheville beginning in 1949, and then in collaboration with Dr. William Watkins onward from 1958. They recorded 60 different marine mammal species, 51 of them for the first time ever. Those are voucher recordings. 15 of these are either seal, sea lion, fur seal, or walrus, aka pinnipeds. So 5 years ago, planning for a traveling exhibition called Seals in Society began with one of our presenters, Dr. Andrea Bogelmoni, along with Liz Bradfield, Ren Betancourt, and Monica DeAngelis, a civilian researcher who works for the U.S. Navy, and I was also part of that process. Elizabeth James Perry joined the team a couple of years later. This 13 panel exhibition debuted here last June and has started its tour around New England. And I need to throw in a quick thank you to the David P. Wheatland Charitable Trust for helping make this exhibit possible. It has been on display at the Providence Lands Visitor Center in Provincetown, at the Seacoast Science Center in Rye, New Hampshire, and at the Audubon Society of Rhode Island Nature Center and Aquarium in Bristol. It is now at the U.S. Naval Base in Newport through the end of April. And for us, and for this exhibition, this is a logical site. The museum and has an educational partnership agreement with the Naval Undersea Warfare Center, and their staff did the final graphic layout and fabrication. The tour will continue this summer and may include a stop on Long Island. So with all that in mind, I will introduce our presenters in reverse order so we can get on with the show. So we have Kimberly Murray, who leads the Seal Ecology and Assessment Program within the Protected Species Division at NOAA Fisheries in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. She is responsible for coordinating research into the abundance, distribution, foraging, ecology, and mortality of seal populations in the Northwest Atlantic, with the focus on gray and harbor seals. Domestically, she partners with many individuals and organizations within the Northwest Atlantic Seal Research Consortium to conduct research, and internationally, she is involved in several working groups responsible for assessing the status of seal populations in Europe, Scandinavia, and Canada. She received her bachelor's degree in biology and environmental studies from the University of California, Santa Cruz, where her thesis research focused on the foraging physiology of captive California sea lions. She completed a Master's of Environmental Management degree from Duke University, where her master's thesis research focused on the bycatch of harbor porpoises. Then Dr. Andrea Bogelmoni, known to many of us as Dre, is a community scientist, naturalist, artist, biologist, and conservationist with a passion for the ocean, working with a range of collaborators, including scientists, fishermen, and artists. She aims to understand not just seals, but our human relationship with the natural world, and to identify ways we can help preserve, protect, and sustainably use the limited resources nature provides. Dr. Bogomoni has an interdisciplinary skill set, including scientific research, education, and outreach. Her bachelor's degrees are in studio art and wildlife, and fisheries and conservation biology from University of California, Davis. She holds a master's degree in marine biology from Boston University and a doctorate in pathobiology and veterinary science, as well as a certificate in public health from the University of Connecticut. Dre was a postdoctoral fellow and guest investigator at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. She has taught marine mammal science and conservation courses at several institutions and started the seal research program at the Shoals Marine Lab a decade ago. She is also the chair and co-founder of the Northwest Atlantic Seal Research Consortium. Through all her work, Dr. Bogomoni hopes to amplify the voices of those who can provide the knowledge needed to mitigate human impacts as we manage ocean ecosystems. Lastly, I appreciate her energy, her dedication, her modesty, and her collaborative nature. It's my pleasure to welcome Andrea back via Zoom for tonight's presentation. She led an online presentation for us back in December of 2021. Dre, floor is yours.
Thank you. And thanks for that intro. And I'll say dog wrangler. So my dog's right next to me and she's been a little feisty. So she might make an appearance. So sorry. Let me share my screen and put my puppy away and hope for the best. Thanks, Bob, so much. And Kimberly, it's so fun to have you and I both be able to present. Let's see. All right. So working? Good? Awesome.
Looks good.
All right. Perfect. Well, thank you for that. And I am extremely excited that the Seals and Society exhibit has a home with the Whaling Museum. And thank you for all your efforts over the years to make it happen. And I do want to spend just a second highlighting this exhibit because it's just been an amazing way to work with amazing co-creators, Ren Betancourt, Liz Bradfield, Elizabeth James Perry, and our contributing editors, Bob and Monica DeAngelis, and to the design hero of the story, Carrie Sparrow, who's just amazing. But this is the exhibit just to give you an idea of what it looks like and hopefully some of the amazing content. So go check out the website. There's a great little video and you can learn more. But that leads me, I guess, directly into the story to try and immerse everybody into why seals in society. So just for a second, really wanted to put this image up to give you a moment to try and immerse yourself into the world of seals, into this amazing environment, and remember the animals that we're talking about. And for a second, really hone in on this amazing landscape. This is actually in the Gulf of Maine off the Isle of Shoals. These are two gray seals. And just thinking about our connection for a second, not the data, not the conflicts, but just these amazing creatures and the world that they live in and what it's like for these animals throughout history and time in the worlds that they live in. And they're fascinating. And the fascination with these animals, either, how they look at you, how they remind us of dogs, how they remind us of ourselves, is a connection throughout our history, a history of humans. And this fascination goes back as far as we can record in human history, thousands and thousands of years. And it's across the globe, wherever seals are, these stories about these connections come through. And one of my favorite stories ever to share is that about Sedna. And I will keep it very short and just read the title about her. You can look her up more. But she is the goddess of the sea, marine mammals, and ruler over the Inuit underworld. And her story, to make it brief, she was in a big argument with her father. Her fingers got cut off. They fell to the sea, and they were first the pinnipeds. They were first the walrus, the seals, and the sea lions. And after that, it became more of the other sea creatures, the whales, the dolphins, the porpoise. But the fundamental start of her story is that connection to these pinniped species and the harvests that occur. And the story is if you upset her, she will make it impossible to have a harvest. So better to pay attention, not take too much, and appease Sedna. And this story is very central and very critical in the Inuit community. Across the ocean, there's a story that I love. It's that about selkies. Selkie is the Scottish word, which basically means gray seal. And there are so many variations of this story in the Shetland Islands, in the region of the world where the story, again, very briefly, is a selkie takes a human form from a seal form until oftentimes she it becomes upset, gets her pelt back that has been taken, and runs back to the ocean again, leaving her human counterpart behind. And that story is one that has gone throughout the centuries, really continued on. And even today, this is a poster from a movie called Song of the Sea. And it's a modern day reiteration of the story that keeps persisting through time. The stories are not just in the Shetland Islands. The stories go to the Northwest Pacific, the boy who lived with seals, to the Inuit stories. It also goes to the Pacific Islands, the Hawaiian story of Lono, which translates to dog running in rough seas. And monk seals are considered protectors of human souls at the afterlife. In ancient Greek, Samoth, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, and I apologize, underwent a wondrous transformation into a seal to evade the clutches of the king Aegina. Her son is Focus, the seal. In the Wampanoag culture as well, marine mammals persist. We learned about the stories of Moship and Squant, which I'm very grateful for. But it's not just the stories of these giants. There's stories and cultural significance, as seals were considered kin and also part of a clan. So across time, we know that these relationships have been there with pinnipeds, with seals. And my favorite story, and I always have to share this because I'm always just blown away by it, my favorite seal story is that of Selkie. Selkie was the oldest gray seal in captivity and lived to be 43 years old. The cooler fact is that Selkie is a former Navy SEAL that was actually trained to use a screwdriver, so an actual real Navy SEAL. And so our fascination isn't just through stories, there's actually real folklore, real stories about how amazing these animals are. And in our local backyard, it's really important to remember that these stories have been there, and some of these stories are only recently becoming known to us. For at least, this is just a minimum, we know that this relationship with seals and humans goes back at least 4,000 years. We have sea level rise, we have climate change, we have impacts to shoreline that we may not be able to ever access in places where these relationships may now forever be inundated underwater. But in places above the sea level line, we know that we have things called shell middens, kind of like the garbage heap of our indigenous peoples. And in these shell middens have been found bones. And these bones have been found to be identified back to gray seals and harbor seals. And these bones give us an idea in these middens about the use, the cultural practices, and the overlap between humans and seals right here in our own backyard. So the story isn't new. 4,000 years is a long time ago, but we know that there's evidence for these overlaps of seals and people living together. Okay, so now we're going to fast forward a whole lot of years and go a couple millennia forward. And in a very short period of time, our waters, our New England, very creatively named by those from England, decided to make use of this amazing land with all these resources, and quickly, in a matter of just 100 years, colonized the region in a way that really impacted our region. So in New Bedford, in the area where the Whaling Museum is a great example, we had cities, people, communities, thousands of people coming into the area because of the rich resources that were present. The whaling fishery is a great example of just the impacts that this had in terms of use of those resources. And again, we're going to fast forward, more time into this era of resource exploitation. So going from the 1600s, the 1700s into the 1800s, there was just a massive exploitation of resources. So on the left, those are whale oil barrels there in New Bedford. And on the right is a picture from Boston Harbor of fishing boats coming into port. And what this did was, in a very short period of time, exhausted the resources present in the region. And this is a quote that I love. It says, "It is only in the last few years, when the fishing fleet has suffered from a marked scarcity of haddock, that the folly of the belief in the inexhaustibility of nature has become potent." So as the whales went away and the fish went away, we had species that were actually caught in the crossfire. And those species that we talk about are the pinnipeds, the harbor seals and the gray seals, which I'm sure before this time, maybe people didn't give them much thought around their waters. But as fish started disappearing and resources started becoming more exploited, the harbor and the gray seal got a lot more attention. So in the 1800s, when there was this known era of exploitation at its highest peak, where even whales became hard to find, Maine and Massachusetts put seal bounties on harbor and gray seals. And that started in the 1880s. And the reason for that was because of this perception of extreme competition, that the number of animals was rising and that they must be removed in order to save these fisheries. So that was very, very effective. And there was a bounty on snouts and flippers. So if you aren't familiar, you could bring a nose of a seal into town hall and they would give you between $1 and $5 per nose. What this did was, by law, by state-sanctioned bounties, caused the destruction, as it was presented, as the destruction of seals in our region. And so in less than 80 years, so think about the history right now. We were talking about millennia to just hundreds of years to now just 80 years. Gray seals were extirpated from the United States. It was near impossible to find one. They were gone. And only a few hundred harbor seals remained in the region in less than 80 years' time. So fortunately, some people thought this wasn't a good thing. And in 1965, Massachusetts led the charge to actually protect gray seals because they were now basically gone. So a law was put in place to reverse the bounties and set the protection for gray seals. And it said that if you were to harm, that's this area that's focused on, detain, hunt, kill, or injure a gray seal, you should be fined not to exceed $500, which back in the 1960s was a considerable amount for a species that was just, you were being given money to actually kill. And fortunately, again, it was successful. And fortunately as well, the whole country started thinking about, what are we doing to our ecosystem? What are we doing to these species as they are now all becoming harvested or exploited? And so the Marine Mammal Protection Act was passed in 1972 as the population of great whales was almost nil, and other species as well. And most importantly, to remember in this story, because this is part of a bigger story that we will learn a lot about, I like to tell people, it wasn't because of, walrus have cool tusks or narwhals are amazing because they look funny or that there's fur on these animals. It was because the primary objective of the MMPA was to maintain the health and stability of the marine ecosystem. There was an understanding that we were removing something in our system that was critical for the health and well-being of ourselves and our ecosystem. And again, fortunately, we had success. This is Muskeget Island a couple years ago. And I love this picture because just thinking about what it was not even 100 years ago to now, where you can see an area full of pups and moms and activity on this really, really small island today. and you see that the populations are increasing. And this is amazing to think about the success of conservation. So this is highlighting some of the work from Stephanie Wood showing a rate of increase on the islands where we know these animals pup. So Muskeget and Monomoy are in Massachusetts, Seal Island is in Maine, and Green Island's in Maine. And you can see that this rate of increase is pretty high in these areas for the number of pups present there. And that's, to me, this wonderful thing. But it's also conflict. When we see this success come very fast, it's caused a lot of conflict. And every year I add to this little compilation I'm about to show you, and every year there's another story to add to this. But the headlines continue to look like they did in the 1880s. So these are my favorite. I'd love to share. Gray seal population, plague or pleasure. New England fishermen back the call of exploding gray seals, and the seals are like vermin. Really, it's really out of the 1800s. And the headlines continue. A lot of them relate to the intersection between white sharks in our region and seals, and this really lack of understanding of what it means to be in a system where we have an animal that's returning or repopulating, rebounding this area that it once was in. And these calls for culls, my favorite, counter the seal tsunami, really thinking about what these animals are doing in our system have been the topic of multiple headlines. This last one was just, I think, 2 months ago, should we bring seal hunting back to the Northeast, came out. And this was the one that really, I think, shocked me the most, having an elected official call for the cull of gray seals. But where do we go from there? What do we do? Do we, sit in a panic as a scientist, as a conservation person, as somebody who interested in natural history and fishing? What do we do? How do we work together to figure out where do we go from here? And I just wanted to highlight really briefly, there are people that are thinking about this together and collaboratively. One of the organizations is the Northwest Atlantic Seal Research Consortium, which really started in 2008 and during a time of turmoil. And the title that the Boston Globe picked up couldn't say it any better. It says, "Scientists hope to help seals and humans better coexist." And I would say it's not just scientists, we're fishermen, we're landowners, we're business people, a group of just individuals who are trying to figure out how do we work in a system where an animal is returning to it. And to highlight that, it's really been very impactful to figure out how to work together to understand complexities. And one of my favorite absolute just joys is working with the White Shark Conservancy and the Cape Cod Commercial Fishermen's Alliance and the Northwest Atlantic Seal Research Consortium, all very long names, apologize, but working together in the Cape Cod Commercial Fishermen's Peer Host Program at the dock with fishermen, with seal biologists, with white shark biologists, educating the public about what we know and sharing with each other the information that we have to dispel some of the misinformation that's out there for everybody. And the other part that's been really amazing is figuring out how to tell those stories. And I really do feel that it is the responsibility of all of us, especially scientists, to do a better job of telling the stories of what we know so that we can move forward in our history and learn from our mistakes, hopefully not go back in the same circle. So whether it's talking about surprising connections, this is one of the panels from our exhibit, or how do we just even ask the question of how do we share knowledge and different ways of knowing together so that we can share this information? And we're still learning so much. This is a still shot from Ren Betancourt's wonderful little short video. She has a couple of these. This one is fertilizing the ocean. They're all stop film animation. But just thinking about how do we share, how do we understand, how do we put the puzzle together? And for me, a big component of that was really taking a step back and working to understand relationships and remembering that relationships and kinship specifically isn't just between people, but between all living beings, and understanding that the stories that we tell have to include that type of work as well in the stories that we're going to share. So there's still a lot more out there we need to know, and there's a lot of hidden stories that are unfolding. And it is so fun being able to work in modern times, right? I know this is a history conversation, but what are we creating now? What are the stories that are coming out? And that's where I'm just absolutely so thrilled I get to turn my time over to Kimberly and switch the conversation over, because she's going to tell us a lot more about what we know and what we're learning as well. So I'm going to stop sharing and hope this works and switch it over to you, Kimberly.
Thank you, Dre. That was great. Okay, I am going to share my screen. Can you see? Okay, great. So thanks again. I'm going to pick up where you left off and share a little bit about what we've been learning about harbor and gray, aka selkies, as Dre mentioned, in the Northwest Atlantic over the last couple of decades. And as Dre said, it really takes a community. What I'll be sharing today is due to the hard work and dedication of a lot of different organizations that are working collaboratively together in the Northwest Atlantic to study these seals. And they're studying them not just to learn about them, but to really carve a path to coexistence between seals and people. I work at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, which is in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, and we are the science arm to the Greater Atlantic Fisheries organization in Gloucester, and they are the more management side of things. So in our shop, we are really focusing on research to manage people's behaviors so that we can promote recovery and ecosystem health under policies like the Marine Mammal Protection Act and Endangered Species Act. So these are some of the topics that I'm going to be touching on today really briefly. And just for the little that we know, there is just so much more that we don't know about these animals. And that's why I say that they have, many secrets. Keep in mind, as I'm going through this, that we're in a time right now where we are witnessing great change in our marine ecosystems due to climate and human population growth. And those changes have effects all through the trophic food web, which has implications for the survival and distribution and behavior and reproductive performance of seals. They're also intersecting more and more with the growing human population, which has repercussions for individual fitness. And they might be more susceptible to pathogens in the environment as pathogens move around in response to changes in thermal temperatures, ocean circulation, and redistribution of species. So I'm going to start with abundance. We get a lot of questions are how many seals are there? And I'll start with the harbor seals. So our best estimate of the harbor seal population in the Northwest Atlantic is around 61,000 animals. And that was done from a survey last conducted in 2018. So we're a little out of date already. We do our surveys in Maine when most of the animals are available to be seen during the pupping season. The right is showing trends over the past couple of last 20 years for the adults and the pups. And right now we think the population is pretty stable. So this is showing a percentage of increase each year. And we're at kind of a zero growth for the adults. Maybe less for the pups, certainly less than it was 20 years ago, but we think overall it's pretty stable. It's a bit different story for the gray seals. The gray seals that you see in the area are part of a much larger Northwest Atlantic stock, most of which is in Canada. And in our last assessment, which was in 2021, we estimated about 400,000 in the whole stock, or I should say population. And we derive those estimates from counts of the pups that are on the colonies, which are shown in the stars there. And as you can see, just a small portion of that stock is in the US. And this is just in the wintertime. We know that there's likely a lot more during other seasons, but we just don't have good estimates of abundance outside of the wintertime. And I want to draw your attention to two of the colonies, the biggest in each Canada, Sable Island and Muskeget, which Dre mentioned earlier. As Dre indicated, the gray seals were hunted close to extinction back in the early 1900s. And thanks to the hard work of Valerie Rue, who documented the return of gray seals to the area in the late 80s. Through her careful notes and observations, she began to document the seals that were coming to have their pups on Muskeget. And there were so few that she could name them, like Mounts and Checkers and Meebs. And she noted that in 1992, there were 12 pups with their moms, and 3 of the females were marked as pups on Sable Island, Nova Scotia. So she really did document that return and the immigration from Canada. So we're still seeing that rate of increase today, as Dre indicated earlier. It's been very steep on Muskeget over the past 30 years. This is an animal with a brand, like Valerie Roux noted, that was found with a pup. I took this in 2020, and at that time she was 18 years old. We know that these high rates of increase are due to natural population growth, but also the immigration from Canada. This is what it looks like today. This is the results from our survey we did just this past January. And the pink are the pups. There was about 5,000 of them, so a lot more, and too many to name. But this is Muskeget today. So we know they move around between Canada and the US, but sort of domestically, where are they going? What are they doing? And I think the best way for me to think about movements is to think about their energetic needs. So seals haul out when they have their pups, when they molt, and they don't really eat a lot during that time. So when they go back out to sea after those extended periods on land, they feed a lot. And they may come back to shore to rest between their foraging bouts. We've been studying the movements of both gray and harbor seals over the past couple years using satellite tags. And these satellite tags can also collect information on their dive behaviors, which is just an example of that is shown on that graphic in the right-hand corner. And we know that these seals disperse very broadly from their natal colonies, which are the triangles in the graphic here. So they're not just staying close to home. And what they're doing when they're going off to sea like this is something that we're looking at right now with the dive data as well. And the adults, while we haven't tagged as many, they do show similar patterns where they have broad dispersal away from the haul out colony after they leave. We recently tagged some harbor seals in New York, and this is just a couple weeks ago, and these are the current tracks as of March 7th. It's still pinging away, but harbor seal movements are a bit different from the gray seals. They are a bit more seasonal in their movements. So most of the population is, I should say, adult population is congregated in Maine during the spring and summer. And then we'll see them down in these parts and in the mid-Atlantic and parts of even Virginia come fall and winter. So this guy left New York and made his way up to Maine, where he's still swimming around right now. All right, so what are they doing when they're off at sea? What are they eating? So this is a typical marine food web from your zooplankton and phytoplankton at the bottom all the way to your top predators. And this is just to make the point that we all know trophic systems are very complex. Each of these numbers in here is attached by some way to another number in this graphic. Seals are considered mesopredators, so they're up here, not at the tippy top, but just below. And at that level in the food chain, they can influence a lot of other layers in this system. So there's a lot of different ways to study diet, one of which is looking at hard parts in stomachs. And we have colleagues that have been looking at the hard parts of stomachs from animals that have been caught in commercial fisheries over the last 20 years. So this graphic is not intended for you to read at all. The graphic here is just showing prey. And the point is that they eat a lot of different prey. They are considered opportunistic feeders. They tend to sort of eat where they are at. and they eat a wide variety. I have pulled out some of the most important prey as identified by their studies and where they overlap. So both species were eating different species of hake and small cod and things like Gulf Stream flounder. And then there were species of prey that were eaten by each species individually. But the nice thing about what they're doing is they grouped those prey species into the different trophic guilds, planktivores, piscivores, and benthivores. And what we're trying to do is take that a little farther and link that to some of the information that we're getting from the dive behaviors of these animals. So this is a graphic of an example of one seal dive profile. Where it's hauled out are these yellow bands, and between that it's diving, and the colors of the dots represent whether or not the dive was in the water column, being pelagic, or down toward the bottom, being benthic. And when we look at this, we can kind of see where in the water column they might be feeding, and we also know now what sort of trophic guild from this same age class of animal they may be feeding at. And so when we put those two together, we can kind of get a better picture of how they're influencing that massive trophic food web. But studying diet is really difficult. And I guess the important message to just get across is that for gray and harbor seals, their diet composition is very diverse. It's going to vary across males and females and adults and juveniles. They don't eat all the time. Their consumption rates vary. There's times when they're not eating at all during the year, and then times when they're eating more often than others. Contrary to some beliefs, studies have shown that adults and juvenile diet is not dominated by large commercial fish. And as mesopredators, they can regulate the abundance of other predators. So that can be a beneficial thing or not a beneficial thing, depending on how you look at it. I want to talk a little bit about health and disease. This is work that we're doing with our partners at Marine Mammals of Maine and Tufts Veterinary School. When we capture these animals, we are collecting swabs and blood samples, and they are particularly interested in levels of antibodies and live virus in these animals. And that's because several unusual mortality events have impacted these populations over the last several decades on both sides of the Atlantic. And these events have been related to influenza and morbilliviruses. And some of these events are much more devastating than others. But while we know sort of what happens during the events, we don't really understand how they happen or what is happening in the population around these events. So the last unusual mortality event was declared in 2022 in Maine due to higher than average levels of strandings in Maine of harbor seals. And just before that, in 2021, a form of influenza, a highly pathogenic avian influenza, which is particularly virulent strain that's almost fatal to the host, appeared in gulls in Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. That virus spread across the United States and killed millions of poultry, infected wild bird populations, spread into small mammals. And as we know from COVID, viruses can reassort and reform in many different ways. So this one strain of the virus spread across the US, and a separate strain did not spread, stayed local to the Northeast region, but then spilled over into seals in June of 2022, unlike the previous strain. And that was the reason for the 2022 unusual mortality event declaration. So what folks are doing at Tufts and other groups is really trying to get a better idea of how these viruses are transmitted. They know that it's carried in gulls, but they do not quite understand the vectors of how the virus moves into mammals, whether it's direct contact or whether or not it can be transmitted from mammal to mammal. And if that's the case, it has implications for human health as well. Lastly, just to touch on the human interactions that we're seeing more and more of as these populations are increasing. As you all know, particularly probably in the New Bedford era, we are entering a new era of ocean industrialization. The Biden-Harris administration announced a goal of, I think, 30 gigawatts of offshore energy production by 2030. And this is a map on the left of millions of acres that are now leased for wind development, with the cables there going to the mainland. And one of the things we're doing right now with the tag data is trying to understand the movement and behaviors of seals in these areas that are leased for wind energy. But we really don't know how these structures are going to affect the behavior and distribution of the animals right now. We're also seeing a lot of incidental mortality of gray and harbor seals in commercial fishing gear. The bycatch of gray seals is the highest level of all marine mammals in the United States. And this is a big problem for fishermen and for the seals themselves. But as Dre indicated, it is an opportunity to learn from these events. For instance, this is where we're getting all the samples to study the diet of these animals. But it really is going to take a community approach to solving the problem, to understand the mechanisms for why it's happening, and to design solutions for mitigating the problem. And I love this picture of Dre and her friend Doug, who's a fisherman, working together to look at the contents of a stomach of a seal. And it was really enlightening, I think, for him in that event to know what they were eating and that they weren't eating the same thing he was targeting. And I just love that. So we're going to need more of that work. We're also going to see a lot more strandings as seals become more and more in contact with dense human population centers. You know, they really don't have wild, uninhabited places where they can go. This study by Holland Haverkamp showed that the patterns of strandings over the last several decades was more closely tied to proximity to coastal human populations than any kind of environmental signal. Some of you may have remembered Schubert. Schubert the seal went into Beverly Pond up in Beverly, Massachusetts, and ended up right in front of the police station. So we might be seeing more of these events. Again, it's a good opportunity to learn from these cases. But yeah, definitely keep your distance if you can and give them their space, and hope that the stranding responders put them back where they're supposed to be. And that's really all I have. I just wanted to sort of end with this quote, which I love, because it makes me think about how seals have taught us so much about what is going on right now in the marine environment. And I'm so happy to be able to study them and that they're there and not being hunted. This was taken on Muskeget. And, you know, I just think back, you know, in 1960, they were being hunted, and now there's thousands of them teaching us about what's happening in the environment. And this to show that maybe coexistence is possible. So that's all I have. I guess I'll turn it back over to Bob now to take some questions.
Well, thank you both. That was fantastic. The science guy in me is very satisfied right now. It's always fun when I get to learn lots of new things. Even though several years ago, previous job, we had created a program, and we would go to schools to talk about harbor seals, and we had a 5-foot-long life-size model of a harbor seal. You could unzip it, pull out all of the internal organs. Kids just got totally jazzed by how cute these things are. But one of the things I would share with the students, and I would say, if you would ever see seals hauled out, wherever it is, the best thing you can do is nothing. So would you still agree with that, you know, with that assessment? And like with whale sightings on whale watch boats, is there a place where people should call or could call for seal sightings? So I'll throw that out to both of you.
Yeah, I would say definitely give them space. That you know, they are protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and we need to sort of keep our distance from them. But some of them might need medical attention, and there are stranding organizations within different regions that one can call and leave it to them to come and assess whether or not that seal can be taken in for medical evaluation or just left alone to go back out to sea.
But there's no need, like in the case of the North Atlantic right whale, to report a sighting just to let people know that you've seen it, because there are places where you just expect to see them anyway.
Yeah, if it's tagged or branded, you can call your local stranding network. It's a great way. We're in the consortium, actually, the SEAL consortium had a site where you can not at this moment report sightings. You can find out where the tag is from that you might have seen and call the organization. That's the Marine Animal Identification Network. So you can go online and look for it. But the best thing to do is really to call your local stranding network, and they can assist in identifying where it's from, or you can go on that site as well. But there's not a mandatory you should report.
Right.
But it is very helpful, as those tags on those animals might be one of Kimberly's that, she wants to know where that seal is. And those have numbers usually on them. So I don't know if I still have one behind me. My dog might have chewed on it potentially. But that's what they look like. This one got a little you got for this one, but this one has the NOAA number on it. And if you see something like that, then
hopefully not dog chewed, but yes, that's great. That's great.
She's looking at me right now.
And I'm glad that you mentioned tags. So I was going to ask, both in terms of attaching those tags and then the transmitters that you put on some of these animals, what's the most challenging part of doing that?
Capturing the animals. I mean, I would say definitely for the ones that aren't the young ones, capturing the animals. The younger ones are a little bit easier to capture, but they're still hard to restrain. So trying to restrain, wild seals, we don't sedate the young ones. We would sedate the older ones, but just trying to keep them still and be as quick and efficient as possible so that we can get them on their merry way is probably the most challenging part.
So you're saying that this is not a solo task?
No, it's always a team of people. And that graphic I showed in the front with all the different organizations, and that's always what it is in these capture events. It's a lot of different academic partners, nonprofit organizations, stranding network members, even, sometimes just, people that are volunteering can, this takes a village, definitely. Yeah.
And are there different transmitters for different purposes, or is it all just to track where they're going?
Definitely. Yeah. There's different transmitters. So we're using a particular type of satellite tag. There's lots of different variations of satellite tags. So that's communicating with satellites in the sky to transmit positional information. Sometimes you can get a tag that just collects horizontal position, like movement data. Other types of tags collect the dive data. Some of them collect more information about when an animal might be moving its mouth and feeding. There's also different ways to transmit information. Some are communicating with phone towers. Those are GPS sort of phone tags. There's also, different types of tags altogether that are transmitting with acoustics and not via satellite. So definitely depends on your research question and your funding and how many animals you need to sample. And let's go into that choice of data collection device.
So I haven't seen any questions in the chat yet. I do have a couple more that I can throw out there. So Dre, in a previous presentation, you had talked about a rather surprising connection among horses, gray seals, and seagrasses on Sable Island. Would you share that story? Because that was I'm sure that was a big surprise for those who noticed that connection.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I had to, you always have to figure out what you're going to talk about. And that was definitely one that I cut out hesitantly because it's one of my favorite stories. So oftentimes the way we see animals in general is, can I can I eat it, or is it useful to me, right? Like that's it. Is it something I can consume, or does it benefit me somehow? That's why the era of exploitation really happened. But we started, I think, in recent years, really being a naturalist again. A lot of people are just thinking about the world around us and observing. And one of those observations was, hey, the grasses are growing really well on Sable Island. It's the middle of nowhere. It's a spit of sand. All there are horses, seals, and a couple of researchers, maybe some seabirds come through. And the reason the seagrasses were doing so well is because the seals add nutrients to the sand, to the beaches, and that nitrogen input actually helps beach grasses grow, which helps the horses because now they have food to eat. So horses were doing really well because seals are present, adding nutrients and adding grasses, which also helps to make sure that the sand doesn't go away because now you have grasses growing that prevents the erosion of the beaches. So it was this really beautiful connection. There's a few research articles that came out explaining the contributions of nutrients in the cycle. And that same approach has been used in a couple ways, in a couple places to look, including the Cape Cod National Seashore, to see if there's a contribution in areas where seals are returning in other regions to beach health, basically, right? Like, are they contributing to the beach grasses in other areas? So really surprising connection of how horses, seals, and beach grasses are related on Sable Island. So a different value system, I guess, too. I don't want to forget that point of the story of, ecological value is very important, but only, I think, something now we as a society are understanding, or at least admitting that is also important, not just economic value.
So Robert Murray has a question. So Robert, you can unmute if you'd like, or type in your question.
I'm just curious as to what the cost is for the satellite tags.
The cost varies depending on the type of satellite tag it is. It can range from about $1,500 to around $5,000, depending on what type of data are being collected.
Okay, and you mentioned New York. Where did you catch what was it, a harbor seal or a gray seal?
That was a harbor seal. We caught that in Shinnecock Bay, which is on
Where
this
is it now?
right now. It's up in Maine. Yeah, hopefully finding some other friends and females to play around with up in Maine. They're gonna start having their pups probably May-ish. So we expect a lot of the harbor seals to be moving up that way in the next month or two.
Thank you. We have another question from Ronan Long. You'll need to unmute. Go for it.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Great. So first of all, thank you to the speakers. This has been a lovely talk, and I was just wondering what could be some volunteering opportunities that somebody who is interested in contributing to seal conservation, maybe has some scientific background but not like marine biology and such. What are some ways that someone could get involved?
I would ask first, where do you particularly reside, or what area? Because that can help to direct what we can actually offer.
Wonderful. Yeah. Aquidneck Island over in Rhode Island.
Okay.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. So marine mammal stranding networks are always looking for volunteers, and so Rhode Island is Mystic Aquarium, I believe, is the area that would be calling somebody in Rhode Island to go respond to an animal. So that's one really great way. I was I was going to suggest the Cape Cod National Seashore, but that might be too far for you because they have a still education team that works out in the summers as well, doing more of the education part. And in either of those, it's not the science, but the willingness to talk to the public. And then through the consortium, we do have volunteers that go out peer host program, and that's the most useful skill, is just being able to learn information and be able to speak and listen more than anything to the public. I don't know, Kimberly, if you've got other ideas in that region.
No, that's great. My first thought was the stranded networks, because they need people to be out looking and to potentially help gather animals, and of course docents at either state or national parks always take volunteers as well.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
So anybody else with another question? I don't see any new hands have gone up. I could certainly ask another one. I know we're down to about 3 minutes here. So during your years of studying these animals, what shifts in survival challenges have you seen? Is it food-based? Is it, haul out space, competition for food? What would you say?
I think that's a really good question. That's one of the, we're not quite sure. But when populations start to get near their carrying capacity, you start to see changes in survival, and particularly in juvenile mortality. And one of those might be disease driven. So I have wondered if a lot of these unusual mortality events that are happening might have something to do with animals getting close to their carrying capacity, but we don't quite know. They're still, because we still see them increasing at places like Muskeget Island. I don't think it's necessarily a space issue. They are kind of slowing. The rate of increase has been slowing in Canada, and they think that might be more of a resource, like a prey-based issue. So it's really hard to sort of say what impacts their survival. I think it's a lot of different things going on.
Yeah, the one I'm really interested in is just that you have more animals, more people, less space, more development, and how do we continue to have enough space? Because seals are unique in that they need land and they need sea. So we have to be able to provide areas for them to rest, not just when they're pupping, but when they're living their normal lives, and making sure that we have space and education of what to do if, as you said, Bob, in the beginning, just leave it alone. And what do you do? On the West Coast, that is such an issue of this overlap of beach space, human use, and what do we do to coexist? What information do we need to transfer just to be able to share that? Education is so important.
And I'm guessing that my colleague Beatrice is going to tell me that we are right at 6:30 and we should probably call it a wrap. So thank Kimberly, Andre, thank you both very much for taking the time to create your presentations, to share this information with us, to answer the questions, and to also share your passion for this work, because I think that's, talent and training is great, but passion drives it all. So I thank you both for that.
Oh, thanks for allowing us to share.
Mhm.
Yeah, ditto.
So thank you all, and we'll see you at the next Local History Guild, which will happen in about 3 months' time. I know we're going to do one in June, and we'll have 2 people on site broadcasting from our media lab, I think.